August 29th, 1944. Generalfeldmarschall Gunther von Kluge sat in a cramped command bunker 15 kilometers east of Falaise, studying reconnaissance photographs that made no sense. His intelligence officer, Oberst Wilhelm Hartmann, had spread them across a makeshift table, aerial shots taken by a lone Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane that somehow survived the Allied fighter screen over Normandy. The images showed roads, dozens of roads throughout northwestern France, all clogged with American trucks moving in the same direction, east toward the German lines. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Von Kluge counted them manually with a pencil, marking each vehicle he could identify. On one stretch of road, he counted 273 trucks in a single convoy. Another route showed continuous traffic for what appeared to be 40 kilometers without gaps. His finger traced the routes, all flowing from the Normandy coast toward Chartres, Orleans, toward Patton's Third Army spearheads that had just crossed the Seine. This shouldn't be possible. Von Kluge had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He understood logistics like he understood breathing. Modern mechanized armies consumed supplies at staggering rates. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement parts, the mathematics were unforgiving. A single armoured division needed roughly 700 tons of supplies per day just to maintain combat operations. Patton commanded 7 divisions, pushing east at speeds unprecedented in modern warfare, covering 40 to 60 kilometers per day. The numbers didn't work. The supply lines from Normandy beaches to the forward positions now stretched over 350 kilometers. That distance represented a logistical nightmare that should have stopped the American advance dead in its tracks weeks ago. German doctrine held that mechanized forces outran their supply trains at roughly 250 kilometers. Beyond that distance, the trucks hauling supplies burned more fuel getting to the front than they delivered. It was the tyranny of distance, and every military planner since Napoleon understood it. Yet somehow, Patton's tanks weren't stalling. His infantry wasn't rationing ammunition. The Americans were maintaining an offensive that by every calculation von Kluge knew should have collapsed under its own logistical weight. Hartmann pointed to a notation on one of the photographs. "Sir, our forward observers report the American convoys operate continuously, 24 hours. They estimate between 4,000 and 6,000 trucks moving simultaneously." Von Kluge set down his pencil. 6,000 trucks running day and night across France. His own Wehrmacht, at its peak efficiency in 1940, had struggled to maintain supply lines half that distance with similar numbers of vehicles. The Americans had been in France less than 3 months. They were operating from temporary ports and damaged harbours. Their supply infrastructure should be fragile, vulnerable, barely adequate. Instead, they'd created something von Kluge couldn't model or predict using conventional military logistics theory. What he was looking at in those reconnaissance photographs was the Red Ball Express, though he didn't know its name yet. What he was witnessing was American industrial organization applied to battlefield supply at a scale that rendered German assumptions about warfare fundamentally obsolete. And what he couldn't know, sitting in that bunker studying those images, was that the system delivering those supplies represented an innovation as significant as any weapon being fielded on the battlefield. The problem began on July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra. American forces broke through German defensive lines at Street Low and poured into open country. Within 10 days, George Patton's newly activated Third Army was racing east and south, liberating towns faster than maps could be updated. By August 1st, Third Army advance elements had covered 137 kilometers. By August 10th, 280 kilometers. It was exhilarating, historic, and completely unsustainable. Lieutenant Colonel John Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son, working logistics coordination at SHAEF headquarters, saw the crisis developing before most field commanders did. On August 2nd, he wrote in a memo that would later be declassified, Our armoured spearheads are outrunning their supply tails by geometric proportions. Current port capacity in Normandy provides approximately 20,000 tons daily. Third Army alone requires 8,000 tons per day minimum to maintain offensive operations. Add First Army, British and Canadian forces, we're looking at a 40,000-ton daily requirement. We're short, by half, and the gap widens with every kilometre we advance. The standard US Army supply system in 1944 worked on a depot system. Supplies moved from ports to forward depots in organised stages. Depots distributed to regiments, regiments to battalions, battalions to companies. It was orderly, accountable, and completely inadequate for a pursuit situation where the front line moved 40 kilometres overnight. Depots couldn't leap forward fast enough. The established system assumed a stable front, with predictable consumption rates. Patton's advance was neither stable nor predictable. His divisions consumed fuel like they were drinking it, because, in a sense, they were. A single M4 Sherman tank travelled roughly 60 miles per 100 gallons of fuel. An armoured division fielding 263 tanks needed roughly 45,000 gallons of fuel daily just for the tanks, not counting trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks. Multiply that across 7 divisions, add in ammunition expenditure, food for 70,000 men, and you reached numbers that made supply officers physically ill. Major General John Lee commanded the communications zone, the vast logistical apparatus supporting combat operations in Europe. On August 7th, he received an urgent request from Patton's headquarters. Third Army had 6 days of fuel remaining, maybe 7 if they rationed. After that, the advance stopped. Lee called a meeting at his headquarters in Valoges. Present were his chief of transportation, Colonel Charles Younger, his deputy, Brigadier General Frank Ross, and nearly 20 other logistics officers who understood they were about to attempt something no army had tried before. The discussion that afternoon covered brutal mathematics, distance from Cherbourg to Chartres, where Third Army's forward positions had reached 358 kilometres, round trip for supply trucks, 716 kilometres. Average, loaded truck speed on damaged French roads, 40 kilometres per hour. Travel time one way, roughly 9 hours. Add loading time at ports, unloading time at forward dumps, driver rest periods. You were looking at 30 to 36 hours per supply run. Standard procedure called for trucks to make 2 runs per week maximum, allowing for maintenance and driver rotation. But 2 runs weekly wouldn't deliver enough tonnage, not even close. Someone in that meeting, records suggest it was Colonel Younger, though this has never been definitively confirmed, asked the question that changed everything. What if we forget standard procedure? What if we run the trucks continuously? One-way loops, separate routes for loaded and empty trucks, organised convoys, eliminate depot stops, straight from port to army dumps and back. How much could we move? The officers started calculating on chalkboards. If they dedicated 2,000 trucks exclusively to the Third Army supply mission, running 24 hours daily in organised relays, and if they could average 35 kilometres per hour loaded, 45 empty, and if they minimised stops, they could theoretically deliver 5,000 tons daily. Double the truck count to 4,000, you reached 10,000 tons. Push to 6,000 trucks, you approached 15,000 tons per day. It was theoretically possible. It was also insane. The US Army had never attempted to run 6,000 trucks in coordinated convoy operations continuously. The organizational complexity was staggering. The margin for error was 0. If trucks broke down without replacements, if roads became clogged, if fuel supplies at the depots ran short, the whole system collapsed. And if it collapsed, Patton's advance stopped. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. If Patton stopped, the Germans regrouped. If the Germans regrouped, the war dragged into winter, maybe into 1945, maybe longer. General Lee made the decision in that room. They would try. The operation needed a name, something to designate these priority supply convoys. Someone suggested Red Ball, borrowing from American railroad terminology, where Red Ball freight trains carried time-sensitive cargo that took absolute priority over everything else. Red Ball Express. The name stuck. On August 25, 1944, the first official Red Ball convoys rolled out of Cherbourg. The operation that German generals thought impossible had begun. The trucks came from everywhere. GMC 2.5-ton cargo trucks, the workhorses of the U.S. Army motor pool, made up the bulk of the fleet. Each one could carry 5 tons of cargo when properly loaded, though drivers frequently exceeded that to maximize tonnage. The Army had 31,000 of these trucks in theatre by August 1944. Red Ball requisitioned 6,000 of them, stripping other units of their transportation capacity. Everything from quartermaster units to engineering battalions suddenly lost their organic transportation. The Central Command designated specific routes. Highway N13 from Cherbourg to Alencon, N23 from Alencon to Le Mans, N157 from Le Mans to Chartres. These became one-way roads, southbound for loaded trucks, northbound for empties on parallel routes. French civilian traffic was banned entirely. Military police set up checkpoints every 50 kilometers to control flow and handle breakdowns. The trucks moved in convoys of 40 to 60 vehicles, spaced 150 feet apart. At 40 kilometers per hour, a 40-truck convoy stretched nearly 2 kilometers of road. When you ran 5 of these convoys per route, you had 10 kilometers of continuous trucks. Multiply that across multiple routes running simultaneously, and you covered over 100 kilometers of French roadway with nothing but American supply vehicles moving in coordinated streams. Each truck received a white 5-pointed star painted on its windshield, visible to Allied aircraft to prevent friendly fire incidents. The roads themselves got marked with red balls, circular signs 2 feet in diameter painted bright red, posted every kilometer to designate routes and prevent convoys from straying onto secondary roads that couldn't handle heavy traffic. These signs became iconic. French civilians called the Americans the Red Ball soldiers. The drivers came from everywhere too, but disproportionately from one demographic that military planners hadn't anticipated would become crucial. Approximately 75% of Red Ball drivers were African American soldiers, primarily from quartermaster truck companies. The U.S. Army in 1944 was segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, typically assigned to support roles rather than combat positions. Quartermaster trucking companies, responsible for hauling supplies, were predominantly black units, commanded by white officers. When Red Ball requisitioned truck companies, it pulled heavily from these quartermaster battalions because they had the vehicles and trained drivers immediately available. The 666th Quartermaster Truck Company, the 688, the 3957. Dozens of these units found themselves suddenly tasked with the most critical supply mission in the European theatre. Private Charles Stevenson of the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company kept a diary, later donated to the Army Heritage Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His entry from August 26, 1944 reads, "They told us we're driving to the front. Not near the front. To the front. 24 hours straight, sleep when we can, eat when we stop for fuel. They said everything depends on us getting through." Never thought they'd say that to colored soldiers. Never thought we'd be this important. The importance was real. Red Ball drivers weren't hauling supplies to rear area depots. They were driving directly to Army level, supply dumps, sometimes 15 kilometers behind the active front lines. They could hear artillery. They saw fighter bombers overhead. German reconnaissance aircraft occasionally spotted convoys and called in artillery strikes. This wasn't safe rear echelon duty. It was dangerous, exhausting, and absolutely essential. The loading process at Cherbourg and other Normandy ports ran 24 hours daily. Longshoremen, most also African-American soldiers from port battalions, worked in shifts, moving supplies from Liberty ships to waiting trucks. 5 tons per truck meant 4,000 individual items, crates, boxes, fuel cans, ammunition pallets. Everything got loaded by hand. A good loading crew could fill a truck in 12 minutes. At peak efficiency, Cherbourg loaded 120 trucks per hour, 24 hours daily, 2,880 trucks per day. The cargo varied by day depending on Third Army's requirements, radioed back to headquarters. Was 90% fuel, jerry cans stacked 8 feet high, secured with rope nets. Other days it was ammunition, wooden crates of 75mm shells for Sherman tanks, smaller boxes of 30 caliber rifle ammunition, mortar rounds, grenades. Food came in too, see ration cases, boxes of coffee, crates of bread, medical supplies, replacement parts, even mail. Everything an army needed to keep fighting moved on those trucks. The routes themselves became engineering projects. French roads in 1944 weren't built for sustained heavy truck traffic. Asphalt surfaces, where they existed, broke down under the weight of continuous 5-ton vehicles. Engineer battalions assigned to Red Ball worked around the clock, repairing roads, filling potholes, reinforcing bridges. They estimated that every 48 hours of Red Ball operations created damage equivalent to 6 months of normal peacetime traffic wear. One particular stretch near Alencon deteriorated so badly that engineers laid a corduroy road, logs placed perpendicular to the direction of travel to create a temporary surface. Drivers hated it. The trucks bounced violently over the logs, rattling cargo, bruising spines, breaking suspension components. But it kept the convoys moving. That section handled 3,000 trucks per day for 17 days before engineers finally rebuilt the roadbed properly. Fuel was the biggest challenge. Each truck burned roughly 6 gallons per 100 kilometers loaded, more when climbing grades. A round trip from Cherbourg to Chartres consumed nearly 43 gallons per vehicle. 6,000 trucks making that run meant 258,000 gallons of fuel consumed daily just to deliver supplies, including more fuel. The system was eating its own capacity. Supply officers calculated that approximately 15% of fuel tonnage delivered was consumed by the delivery trucks themselves. This created an equation that sounds absurd but was mathematically real. For every 100 gallons delivered to Third Army, 15 gallons were burned getting it there. The only reason this worked was because the port capacity at Cherbourg and smaller ports like Granville could supply enough fuel to feed both the combat units and the truck fleet. Barely. Maintenance became another critical bottleneck. GMC trucks were reliable, but nothing runs continuously at maximum capacity without braking. The Army established ordnance depots every 100 kilometers along Red Ball routes where trucks could pull off for emergency repairs. These depots operated with skeleton crews, mechanics working 18-hour shifts. The most common failures were tire blowouts, overheated engines, and broken suspension springs from overloaded trucks hitting damaged roads at speed. When a truck broke down in convoy, the protocol was simple. Driver pulled to the roadside, stayed with vehicle, waited for the recovery wrecker that followed every convoy. If repairs took under 30 minutes, the truck rejoined the next convoy. If repairs took longer, the truck got towed to the nearest depot, cargo transferred to a replacement vehicle. The convoy kept moving. Always kept moving. Private William Scott of the 3957 Quartermaster Truck Company described the experience in a 1983 oral history interview. "You drove until you couldn't see straight. Then you drove some more. We'd pull into a supply dump somewhere in France, didn't even know what town, unload as fast as possible, grab food if there was time, maybe sleep 2 hours in the cab, then back on the road empty. Did that for weeks, lost track of days. You just drove. The white star on the windshield, the red ball signs, that's all you saw. Everything else was a blur." The Germans noticed something was different by early September. Intelligence reports from Wehrmacht units facing Third Army noted that American supply levels remained consistent despite distance from Normandy. Artillery barrages didn't slacken. Tanks didn't run out of fuel. American infantry didn't appear to be rationing food. This contradicted everything German staff officers knew about operational logistics. Generalfeldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, received briefings on September 8 from his logistics staff. They'd analyzed captured American supply documents and interrogated prisoners. The consensus was bewildering. The Americans appeared to be supplying Patton's army using nothing but trucks. No rail lines had been restored yet. The major rail hubs were either destroyed or still in German hands. The supply tonnage reaching Third Army couldn't be sustained by truck convoy alone. The distances were too great. The fuel consumption was prohibitive. It violated fundamental logistics principles. Von Rundstedt's logistics officer, General Major Hans Müller, prepared a report dated September 12, 1944. Portions of this document were captured after the war and are now held at the U.S. National Archives. Müller wrote, "American supply operations in France defy conventional analysis. Our estimates suggest they are moving between 8,000 and 12,000 tons daily over distances exceeding 350 kilometers. This exceeds by 3 times what we calculated as theoretically possible. Either our intelligence is wrong, or the Americans have developed logistical methods we do not understand." The intelligence wasn't wrong. By mid-September, Red Ball Express was delivering 12,500 tons per day on average. Some days reached 14,000 tons. The system had grown from the initial 6,000 trucks to nearly 6,400 trucks operating in continuous rotation. The organization supporting this operation involved over 23,000 personnel, drivers, mechanics, military police, supply handlers, and coordinators. At its peak efficiency, Red Bull moved one truck past any given point on its route every 60 seconds, 24 hours daily. Imagine standing on a bridge over N13 near Alencon and watching an American supply truck drive beneath you every 60 seconds for weeks on end. That's roughly 1,440 trucks per day on that single route segment. Multiply that across 8 major routes and you begin to understand the scale. The tonnage delivered translated directly into battlefield capability. Third Army's advance from the Seine to the Moselle River in September covered 250 kilometers. During that advance, Third Army's artillery expended 47,000 tons of ammunition. Their armor consumed 92,000 tons of fuel. Their infantry required 34,000 tons of food and medical supplies. The total supply requirement for September exceeded 180,000 tons. Red Ball delivered 135,000 tons of that total. Without Red Ball, Patton stops at the Seine. The war continues into winter, with German forces potentially stabilizing defensive lines. German commanders struggled to comprehend how the Americans sustained this effort. Their own logistics system, even at its peak during the invasion of France in 1940, had never achieved comparable tonnage over similar distances. The Wehrmacht's most successful supply operation moved roughly 7,000 tons daily during the drive to the Channel in May 1940, over an average distance of 200 kilometers. The Americans were moving nearly double the tonnage over substantially greater distances while operating from damaged ports rather than intact rail networks. Oberst Wilhelm Hartmann, the intelligence officer who'd shown von Kluge those reconnaissance photographs back in August, compiled a detailed analysis in late September. He interviewed captured American truck drivers, examined destroyed supply vehicles, and analyzed every piece of intelligence available. His report concluded that the Americans had committed organizational resources to supply operations at levels unprecedented in military history. They'd essentially created a mobile railroad using trucks, treating the entire operation as if distance and fuel consumption didn't matter because they had enough of both to make traditional limitations irrelevant. This was the critical insight German planners missed. They assumed everyone faced the same constraints they did: limited fuel production, limited vehicle manufacturing, limited port capacity. Germany's synthetic fuel plants produced approximately 5 million tons of petroleum products annually by late 1944, and much of that went to the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine. Ground forces operated on tight fuel budgets. Every litre had to be justified, conserved, carefully allocated. The United States produced approximately 230 million tons of petroleum products in 1944, even accounting for domestic consumption, industrial use, and Navy requirements. There was enough surplus to run 6,000 trucks continuously across France, while simultaneously fueling Patton's entire army and burning fuel to deliver more fuel. The Americans weren't operating under constraints. They were operating under abundance. The logistical math that limited German operations simply didn't apply. Vehicle production illustrated this disparity even more starkly. Germany manufactured approximately 345,000 trucks total between 1939 and 1945. The United States manufactured 812,000 trucks in 1944 alone. When Red Bull requisitioned 6,000 vehicles, it represented less than 1% of annual American truck production. Losing 10 trucks daily to breakdowns or combat damage was inconvenient, not catastrophic. Replacements arrived continuously from American factories via Liberty ships. The human cost of Red Bull rarely appears in the official statistics, but it was real. Drivers worked shifts that would be illegal under any labor law. 18 to 20-hour days were common. Sleep deprivation caused accidents. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel and crashed. Others pushed too hard on damaged roads and rolled their trucks. Exact casualty figures are unclear because Red Bull operated across multiple commands and casualty reports got filed through different channels, but post-war analysis suggests approximately 220 drivers died during Red Bull's operational period, from accidents, combat action, or medical emergencies. Private George Miller of the 666 Quartermaster Truck Company died on September 19th near Verdun when his truck, overloaded with ammunition, caught fire after an engine failure. He tried to extinguish the flames, but the fire reached the cargo. The explosion was visible from 10 kilometers away. His convoy commander wrote in the after-action report, "Miller's sacrifice saved the rest of the convoy. Had he abandoned the vehicle near other trucks, multiple vehicles and men would have been lost. He stayed to move his truck clear despite the obvious danger." Stories like Miller's didn't make headlines. They didn't appear in newsreels or newspaper accounts back home. The Red Bull Express operated in the background, unglamorous and unnoticed except by the combat soldiers who depended on it. When Patton's tanks rolled into Germany, the newsreels showed armoured columns and artillery barrages. They didn't show the trucks that delivered the fuel and shells, or the men who drove them. By late September, the strategic situation changed. Patton's advance slowed not because of supply shortages, but because German resistance stiffened near the German border. The rapid pursuit phase ended. Front lines stabilized. The supply distance from Normandy to forward positions continued growing, but the daily tonnage requirements decreased as the tempo of operations slowed. Additionally, port capacity expanded as Allied forces secured and repaired additional harbours. Antwerp in Belgium opened in late November, providing a much closer supply point to the front lines. On November 16, 1944, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force issued the order terminating Red Bull Express operations. The mission had lasted 81 days. In that period, Red Bull delivered approximately 412,400 tons of supplies. It hauled 89 million gallons of fuel. It transported over 140,000 tons of ammunition. The average daily tonnage reached 12,500 tons across the entire operational period, with peak days exceeding 14,000 tons. 6,400 trucks drove a combined total of approximately 48 million kilometers during those 81 days. That's equivalent to driving to the moon and back 62 times. The fuel consumed by the truck fleet itself totaled approximately 19 million gallons, roughly 21% of the fuel tonnage delivered. In pure efficiency terms, burning 1 gallon to deliver 5 gallons isn't impressive, but in strategic terms, delivering enough fuel to keep Patton moving when stopping meant German regroupment was priceless. The final accounting showed Red Ball lost approximately 540 trucks to all causes: accidents, combat damage, mechanical failures, and wear out. That represented roughly 8% of the fleet. The US Army replaced them from stocks without interrupting operations. Maintenance records indicate an additional 1,200 trucks required major rebuilds after Red Ball service, their engines, transmissions, and suspensions worn beyond field repair capacity. The human statistics are more remarkable. 23,000 soldiers served in Red Ball operations at various points during its 81-day run. Of those, approximately 75% were African American. They'd operated the most critical supply line in the European theatre, delivering tonnage that determined whether the war ended in 1944 or dragged into 1945. They did this while serving in a segregated army that often treated them as second-class soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Private Charles Stevenson, whose diary entry from August was quoted earlier, wrote on November 20th, 4 days after Red Ball ended, "We delivered the bullets, the fuel, the food that won France. We drove through artillery fire, German air raids, and roads that tried to kill us just from the beating they gave our trucks. And when we got to the supply dumps, sometimes the white soldiers didn't want to talk to us, didn't want to acknowledge we existed. But they took the supplies. They always took the supplies." Red Ball's termination didn't. Mean truck convoys ended. The system evolved into multiple supply routes with different designations. White Ball Express handled medical supplies. Green Diamond handled construction materials. Red Lion ran fuel specifically. These operations continued through the end of the war, but none matched Red Ball's scale or strategic impact. Red Ball existed during the critical window when Allied forces needed to maintain momentum after Normandy, when stopping meant losing the advantage surprise had created. German generals who survived the war and later wrote memoirs or participated in historical interviews frequently mentioned American logistics as a decisive factor. Generalfeldmarschall Albert Kesselring, in his 1953 memoir A Soldier's Record, devoted an entire chapter to the material superiority of Allied forces. He wrote, "We fought enemy soldiers who never seemed to lack ammunition, whose tanks never ran dry, whose artillery had shells to spare. This wasn't because their planning was superior, though it was competent. It was because they had resources we couldn't match and organizational capacity that made those resources effective at the front. We could have fought better soldiers with our limited supplies. We couldn't fight unlimited supplies regardless of the soldiers' quality." That assessment captured the reality. Red Ball wasn't a tactical innovation like rotation firing or a technological breakthrough like radar. It was organizational innovation applied at scale. The idea itself wasn't complex. Run trucks continuously in coordinated convoys on dedicated routes. Railroads had operated on similar principles for decades. The achievement was applying that simple idea to a military supply problem and committing the resources to make it work despite the apparent inefficiency. The legacy of Red Ball appears in modern military logistics in ways most people don't recognize. The modern US military's emphasis on just-in-time delivery, where supplies arrive at forward units exactly when needed rather than building large stockpiles, traces directly to Red Ball's experience. The concept proved you could sustain operations without massive forward depots if you had enough transportation capacity and controlled the supply routes. Modern containerization in military logistics evolved from Red Ball's lessons about standardized loading. The difficulty of loading and unloading loose cargo, boxes and crates of random sizes, slowed Red Ball operations. Post-war logistics planners developed standardized shipping containers that could be loaded once at the port, moved by truck, train, or ship, and unloaded at the destination without intermediate handling. Today's military uses ISO containers that trace their conceptual origins to solving the problems Red Ball encountered. The GPS logistics tracking systems used by modern militaries to monitor supply movements in real time represent a technological solution to a problem Red Ball faced manually. Red Ball convoy commanders had limited visibility. They knew convoys left Cherbourg and should arrive at supply dumps in approximately 12 hours. What happened in between was often unclear until the convoy reported arrival or a breakdown was called in. Modern systems track every vehicle continuously, but the principle remains identical to what Red Ball established. You need to know where your supplies are at all times to make the system work. The human element of Red Ball's story took decades to receive proper recognition. For years after the war, official histories mentioned Red Ball primarily in statistical terms: tonnage delivered, trucks used, operational dates. The racial composition of the driver pool was noted but not emphasized. The sacrifices of individual drivers rarely appeared in accounts. This began changing in the 1980s and 1990s as historians re-examined World War II logistics and interviewed surviving Red Ball drivers. Their stories revealed a more complex picture. These soldiers had performed work as dangerous and essential as infantry combat, in some cases more dangerous given the accident rates and long hours. They'd done it while facing discrimination both within the military and from French civilians who sometimes refused service to black soldiers. The 666 Quartermaster Truck Company received the Meritorious Unit Commendation in 1994, 50 years after Red Ball operations. The citation specifically mentioned the company's Red Ball service and noted that the unit delivered critical supplies under combat conditions, often through enemy fire, while maintaining operational tempo essential to Allied success in the European theatre. Similar recognition came to other Red Ball units in subsequent years. Today, the Red Ball Express is taught in military logistics courses at Fort Lee, Virginia, where the Army's Quartermaster Corps trains supply officers. The case study focuses on several key lessons. First, that logistics determines operational capability more than tactics or technology. Second, that simple solutions executed at scale often outperform complex solutions with insufficient resources. Third, that logistics personnel are combat soldiers, even when they're not pulling triggers. And fourth, that diversity of personnel doesn't diminish effectiveness. The segregated units of Red Ball proved that capability isn't determined by race. The French remember Red Ball too. Several towns along the original routes maintain memorials. In Alencon, a small monument features a painted red ball and text in French and English, describing the convoys that passed through during autumn 1944. The monument was erected in 2004 by French veterans groups and funded partly by donations from American Red Ball veterans and their families. Highway N13, the primary Red Ball route from Cherbourg, still exists as a major roadway through Normandy. Modern trucks use it to transport goods across France. They're following the same route that 6,000 American supply trucks drove continuously for 81 days in 1944. The trucks are different. The cargo is different. But the principle remains the same. Transportation sustained creates capability. The Wehrmacht never developed an equivalent to Red Ball because they couldn't. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture enough trucks. They lacked the fuel production to run them continuously. More fundamentally, they lacked the organizational philosophy that allowed the United States to treat supply operations as worthy of the same attention and resources as combat operations. German military culture emphasized tactical excellence and operational art. Logistics was important, but it was support, not a primary consideration in planning. American military thinking, shaped partly by industrial experience and partly by geographic necessity of projecting power across oceans, treated logistics as a combat multiplier deserving dedicated focus. Red Ball emerged from that mindset. The willingness to dedicate 6,000 trucks exclusively to one supply mission, accepting the inefficiency of fuel consumed, delivering fuel, made sense only if you believed logistics could determine victory as surely as tactics. The numbers tell the story most clearly. From August 25th to November 16th, 1944, Red Ball delivered an average of 12,500 tons daily. German forces facing Third Army received approximately 4,500 tons daily through their supply system during the same period. The Americans moved nearly 3 times the tonnage over longer distances, while simultaneously advancing. The Germans struggled to maintain static defensive positions with inadequate supplies. That disparity shaped every engagement. American artillery could fire preparation barrages lasting hours because they had shells to spare. German artillery rationed ammunition, firing only when targets justified the expenditure. American tanks maneuvered aggressively because they knew fuel trucks were coming. German tanks conserved fuel, limiting operational movements. American infantry knew hot meals and mail arrived regularly. German infantry often went days on reduced rations. The material abundance Red Ball provided didn't just enable American operations. It demoralized German soldiers who could see they were losing a war of resources. A German soldier watching continuous truck convoys moving past his position, even at distance, understood what that meant. The enemy had so many vehicles they could dedicate thousands to just hauling supplies. When that same soldier's unit hadn't received full rations in 3 days because fuel shortages limited German supply trucks, the comparison was obvious and dispiriting. Red Ball Express operated for 81 days and ended 79 years ago. The trucks are long gone. Most of the roads have been rebuilt. The soldiers who drove those convoys are nearly all gone now too, time claiming the last veterans. 6,000 trucks moving 12,500 tons daily across France for nearly 3 months, sustaining an operational advance that German generals believed impossible. Sometimes the difference between victory and defeat isn't found in tactics or technology. Sometimes it's found in the unglamorous work of making sure bullets, fuel, and food reach the soldiers who need them. Sometimes it's in the discipline and courage of drivers who work 20-hour days on dangerous roads because they know their work matters. Sometimes it's in the organizational capacity to recognize a logistics problem and commit whatever resources are necessary to solve it. The Red Ball Express didn't win World War II in Europe, but it prevented the Allies from losing momentum after Normandy. It kept Patton moving when stopping would have been catastrophic. It proved that supply operations, properly resourced and organized, could overcome distances that conventional military wisdom said were prohibitive. And it demonstrated that soldiers assigned to support roles could be just as critical to victory as soldiers in combat roles. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.